Move it, weirdo! I heard as I was pushed out of the line. I turned around angrily. Of course, Christina. I glared at her and said, "Or what, you'll bite me?" She laughed and said, "Hell no! All I need to do is show you a mirror!" At the mention of the word mirror, my knees began to shake and I turned red. I hated my weird condition. I was horribly, horribly terrified of mirrors. But before I could reply, Mark rushed up to me and hugged me. He said, "Happy 16th birthday, babe!" Christina started to laugh and said, "Happy? Your parents were so happy they just dumped you in a stupid orphanage." Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm going to tell you about how I went from a poor orphan to a rich heiress. Anger rose in me. She was sort of right. Of all the kids here, I was the only one who didn't know her parents. Everyone else had someone or something. Even Mark's mom had left him a picture of herself, though he never really knew her. Mark turned to her and said, "You want a piece of me, Christina?" She smiled at him and said, "I most certainly do, Mark." I said, "Shut your trap," and dragged Mark away, saying, "I have to show you something." In my dorm, I showed him my most precious possession and said, "Miss Stacy gave this to me this morning. She said when I was left here, this was the only thing I had." Miss Stacy was the principal's assistant, and she'd hidden it away in case someone stole it. Now that I was 16, I could take care of it. Mark said it was lovely and looked expensive. I said, I'd much rather have a picture of my parents. I just wanted to know who they were. He jumped to his feet and said, "I've got an idea. Meet me in the basement after lockup and bring this along." Then he was gone. At dinner that night, Christina put on her nice clothes and her sickeningly sweet smile as we all headed to the dining hall. She rushed to the principal's usual spot and cleaned the seat for him just as he was about to sit down. She then ran to grab his meal from the pantry. His meals always looked the most delicious. We, on the other hand, only got watery porridge. He then gave half of his steak to Christina and loudly said, "This girl here is the only one worthy of treats." We all rolled our eyes. Thankfully, dinner ended, and I went to the basement. In the dark, Mark put his hand over my mouth and said, "Shh!" He led me to the door and pushed it open. Suddenly, we were out on the main road. I asked him what he was trying to do, and he said he knew a jeweler who could trace old jewelry back to its owners. I couldn't believe my ears and I hugged him. He said, "It's my birthday present to you, babe." At the jeweler's, though, the assistant kept telling us to leave. Suddenly, a door at the back opened and a man stepped in. He asked the assistant who we were. I rushed over to him and said, "Please help me. Can you trace the original owner of this?" The jeweler led us to his office. The minute I stepped in, I almost screamed. There were mirrors everywhere. Mark immediately pulled me in a bear hug and told the jeweler to cover them. Then he held my hand and said, "I'm here, babe. I'll look after you." He asked the jeweler to hurry up. After examining it for a while, he told me that it was a precious antique, but he had no idea who it belonged to. My last hope of finding out something about my family seemed dead already. I was devastated, but Mark tried his best to console me as we headed back to the orphanage. As soon as we got back to the basement, a pair of eyes glared at us in the dark. "And where have you been?" But just as I was about to speak, I heard another voice mocking us, and I knew immediately why the principal was in the basement. "Christina!" She said, "See, sir? I told you they were gone." Then to my horror, she told him that she'd heard me talking about some necklace. He demanded to see it and tried to take it from me, but I told him Miss Stacy knew it was mine. The principal was furious. He decided to give the two of us a week of detention. Immediately, Christina said, "Oh no, it's not Mark's fault. She convinced him. I heard them. He just went to keep an eye on her. He shouldn't be punished." The principal agreed and dragged Mark away. Before she left, Christina turned to me saying, "I'll make sure to keep him company for the time being." The next morning, as I waited for Miss Stacy in her office to be assigned my punishment, I could hear voices from the principal's office. He was saying, "Don't worry, my friend. This land is as good as yours. I'll make sure that the old bat sells it to you. Just remember me when you build your hotel." I was shocked. They were selling the orphanage? Just then, Miss Stacy came in and said, "Could you sort these, dear?" But the very first envelope I picked up made me super curious. It was addressed to the principal. I opened it, and what I read almost made me pass out. It was by some woman who said she was the mother of one of the children here. But what was really crazy was that she'd written that the father of her child was the principal. The letter said, "Look after your child, Stephen, or I will ruin you." The next day, as I was working in Miss Stacy's office, a man came in. Miss Stacy immediately led him to the principal's office. Curious, I listened to what was going on. Pretty soon, I heard the man say that he had been looking for his niece Having had no luck, he was planning to sell the orphanage. It was the owner, Mr. Douglas. After a while, I heard the principal ask if the woman in the picture was really Miss Douglas's sister. Then the principal said, "Well, Mr. Douglas, I think I recognize your heirloom. I believe I will have quite the surprise for you when you return next week." The next Monday, I had a plan. I was going to expose the principal and save the orphanage. Mark and I waited for Mr. Douglas at the door, but as soon as he came in, we were both pushed aside. Then Christina ran past us and hugged him, screaming, "Uncle!" It turned out that Christina was his missing niece. The principal had apparently recognized her from the picture. Once things settled, I went up to him and told him we needed to talk. But the minute the principal saw me, he yelled, "Get away from him, you shameless girl!" Then he told Mr. Douglas that I was a bad kid who snuck out at night with her boyfriend. Before I could get a word in, he dragged me to his office and said, "If I ever see you near Mr. Douglas, I will kick you out. Do you understand?" He then told Miss Stacy that I was to stay indoors the whole day. Mr. Douglas was overjoyed at finding his niece, and he decided to spend a few days at the orphanage. A few days later, Mark surprised me with a date in the orphanage garden. He said he hated seeing me upset, saying, "We'll always have each other." Suddenly, I saw something that left me shook. Miss Stacy and Mr. Douglas were behind the bushes. Mr. Douglas was declaring his love for her while she nodded shyly. Then they kissed. Mark and I started laughing. As soon as Miss Stacy saw us, she jumped out of the bushes. She then introduced us to Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas seemed like a kind man, and he offered for us to walk with him. I instantly accepted his offer, even though Mark was a bit hesitant. Just then, the principal came out yelling, "You beast! How on earth are you roaming around freely? And when you're supposed to be in detention! Miss Stacy, aren't you supposed to be taking care of all this?" Before Miss Stacy could respond, Mr. Douglas asked why I was being punished. However, the principal diverted his attention, saying they had important issues to discuss and that Miss Stacy would deal with it. I was furious. The principal couldn't even look at me without thinking of a punishment. I literally couldn't have a few happy hours, let alone a happy life. The next few days, I went around trying to avoid the principal and hung out with Mark until one day, Christina decided to barge in again. Christina said, "Come with me, Mark. I'll get my uncle to adopt you too." Against my better judgment, I begged Christina to plead with her uncle not to sell the orphanage. She simply laughed at me and told me that she didn't care what happened to the rest of us. Just then, Mr. Douglas said, "Don't say that, sweetie." Christina jumped and started giggling. "Oh, I was just joking, Uncle." But he turned to me and asked me why I was upset at the idea of the orphanage closing. I told him that while we, the older ones, could probably make it, the younger ones would be in a lot of trouble. They couldn't work or look after themselves. He looked at me for a minute. I felt nervous, but then he just left, saying, "The city isn't good for my family." The next day, the principal called me and Mark to the office. He said that we were behaving shamelessly, and he had seen us kissing. He yelled and said, "You two are setting a bad example for the kids. I never want to see you together again." Then he ordered us to leave, and as I left, I heard him tell Mark that for the next week, he was to be Christina's personal bodyguard. "You're not to leave her side, do you understand? Your job is to make sure she's happy at all times." Thankfully, something happened that pushed all the drama out of my mind. The next day, we found out the craziest thing. Mr. Douglas had proposed to Miss Stacy. They were having a party to celebrate, and Miss Stacy insisted on having it in the orphanage. For a week, we did nothing but prepare for the party. A few times, Mark would sneak away from Christina, but she would immediately find him, like some bloodthirsty hound. One day, I was sitting in the storeroom. The storeroom had numerous mirrors, and the principal had said I couldn't leave until they all were clean. I couldn't believe he had assigned me this, even though he knew how absolutely terrified I would be. Suddenly, someone grabbed my arm. I screamed, but then I saw it was Mark. It felt like I hadn't seen him in forever. I hugged him and told him I missed him. He asked me to wait outside and quickly cleaned everything. Then he leaned in to kiss me. At that moment, the door flew open and Christina screeched, "Oh, Marky Mark, come here. I have the most important job for you. I'm bored. Come watch a movie with me." Then she practically dragged him away while I wanted to gag. On the day of the party, I was looking for Miss Stacy and ended up in Mr. Douglas's office. On the table, I spotted something. I got closer and gasped. The woman in the picture was wearing the same necklace as me. Just then, I heard the principal's voice from outside the door. He was holding Miss Stacy's hand and said, "Oh, darling Stacy, don't go with him. Stay with me. I love you." Then to my shock, he tried to kiss her. She pulled back, slapped him, and ran away. The principal yelled, "Just you wait!" But I had another problem. The picture! I went to get my necklace, but to my horror, it was nowhere to be found. Just then, Mark came looking for me. He said, "Where are you, babe? The party is starting." I showed him the picture and told him I couldn't find my necklace. He said we'd discuss it with Mr. Douglas later. But at the party, while everyone was busy admiring how lovely Miss Stacy looked, suddenly a murmur ran through the crowd. Someone said, "What a lovely necklace!" I turned to see what the commotion was for and almost passed out. It was Christina, but she was wearing my necklace! Suddenly I was livid. I yelled, "What the hell?" Everyone fell silent, and Mark and Miss Stacy rushed over to me, but I was quicker. I jumped onto Christina, yelling, "You witch! You good-for-nothing thieving witch! Give me back my necklace!" Christina screamed and said it was hers, and the principal knew it too. Suddenly, the two of us were fighting. Miss Stacy jumped in to try and break us apart, but to my horror, Christina took out a mirror and thrust it into my face. I began to scream, and then everything went black. I finally snapped back when I heard a mirror break and Miss Stacy screamed. When I came to my senses, she was lying on the floor, hurt and cut. I stood stunned as everyone gathered around her. Mr. Douglas tried waking her up, but she wouldn't move. He ran around like a madman, yelling for an ambulance. The ambulance came, and Miss Stacy was taken away. Suddenly, Mr. Douglas turned to me and said, "You! This is all your fault!" I tried to explain, but the principal jumped in and shouted, "You disgusting monster! Get away from us and pray that we don't kick you out after what you've done!" But there was no way I was giving up. "Not after this!" I screamed. "That necklace is mine, and you know it! I saw that picture. That woman was wearing it too! Who is she?" But to my utter shock, the principal said I was a liar, and he had never seen me with the necklace. Then he took Mr. Douglas away, saying, "She has a history of violence, sir." The two left, and Christina followed, crying. For the next 2 weeks, everyone was gloomy and silent. There had been no news about Miss Stacy, except that she still wasn't awake. The doctors had apparently told Mr. Douglas that Miss Stacy had lost a lot of blood and also had some heart problems, possibly due to the stress of our fight, and that he should prepare for the worst. But he was acting like a madman. Every morning he left and would only come back at night. I mostly stayed in my room, and Mark was forbidden from seeing me. The last thing he had said was the woman in the picture was Mr. Douglas's sister. The necklace was hers. That meant Mr. Douglas was my uncle, but he hated me. One day, he came back when I was working in the garden. The minute I saw him, I ran over to him to apologize. Miss Stacy was the only person who'd ever looked after me, but as soon as I got near, he gave me a look of death and said, "My niece and I will leave this place as soon as Stacy is better. Don't come near me, ever." That broke my heart, and I knew there was only one thing left to do. The next morning, I slid a note of apology under Mr. Douglas's door and left the orphanage forever. I got onto a bus and went to the next town over, where I worked in a local McDonald's. Even though I missed Mark, I tried to date another guy. Mark would be better off if he dated Christina. I moved into a shelter. Months went by, and then one day, when I got back from work, I almost fainted. At the door sat Mark. The minute he saw me, he ran over to me and dragged me with him. I protested, but he didn't reply. When he finally stopped, I was stunned to see who else was waiting for me. Miss Stacy! They told me Mr. Douglas and Christina were set to leave the next day. I told them, I don't care. He hates me. But they told me I had to try one last time, especially now that Miss Stacy was there to tell him the necklace was mine. We rushed back only to find the entire orphanage in an uproar. A woman was outside yelling at the principal. "I want my child back, you monster!" She was yelling at the top of her lungs that he had left her alone. I knew who she was, the woman who wrote the letter. Just then, Mr. Douglas and Christina came out. The woman jumped at Christina and screamed, "My daughter! My lovely daughter!" Mr. Douglas looked shocked and said she must have been mistaken. Then he stopped. He had seen Miss Stacy, and tears welled up in his eyes at the sight of her. He rushed to her and she said, "Sarah is your niece!" Mr. Douglas looked absolutely lost, and as Miss Stacy told him that she had indeed given me the necklace, and that, on the night of the party, she thought she had seen the principal put something in her glass, but she wasn't sure. But now she knew. She had been ill because of him, not because of me. She said, "After I found out he had stolen Sarah's necklace and I confronted him, he tried to kiss me and asked me to be a part of his plan. When I refused, he knew I was a threat. That woman really must be Christina's mother." Well, After that, things sorted out quite quickly. Mark and I started dating again. I told my uncle about the principal's call I overheard, and he kicked the father-daughter duo out. Even though I was still terrified of mirrors, I started to feel safe. My uncle even decided that we would stay there and look after the orphanage with Miss Stacy, who, by the way, I now call Aunt Stacy.